I'm talking today to Owen Barder, who is Senior Fellow and Director for Europe for the Centre for Global Development. Owen was previously worked at DFID inside the aid system. Owen, where did aid start?
Well, it started back in the colonial era for the UK. Really at around the time of the Second World War, the UK began to realise it needed to spend some money on tackling unrest in some of the colonies. But it really took off after the Second World War as a consequence of the Marshall Plan. This was the aid that the US gave to the countries in Europe at the end of the Second World War to enable them to rebuild. And it really boosted everybody's confidence that by providing a large amount of money for a short period of time, you could really get an economy back on its feet. And it's really that period that launched the aid that we know today.
And it was that group that became the OECD?
That's right. The group of countries that received money from the Marshall Plan and the United States got together to form a club, a kind of lesson learning club, and that formed the basis of the OECD.
And what's the theory that informed, or the idea that informed aid? When you give aid, what's supposed to happen?
Well, the theory back then was that a country needs a certain amount of capital in order to have economic growth, that you need a combination of labour and capital, and if a country didn't have enough economic output, it didn't look as if there were too few people in most developing countries, so they must need more capital. And so in order to
do things like build roads or build hospitals.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So the original idea was that you would fill that there was a gap in domestic savings, that the country wasn't saving enough to invest in its own capital stock, in its own roads, its own infrastructure and so on. So you would fill that gap with foreign savings, that was the idea. And so you would provide aid, and there was literally a calculation done of how much additional capital each country needed to get the economy going and get it on this self-sustaining growth path. And people still today occasionally use that model to calculate how much aid each country needs.
And to what extent has aid been successful in this original ambition?
Well, I think it's interesting to ask yourself what it is we want from aid. That part of it is this idea of creating lift-off in an economy. And there we have a very small number of examples of success. And it's very hard to be clear whether aid itself is the main or indeed part.
And these are countries where aid is either much smaller or no longer deployed.
Well, so I mean, countries like South Korea, Botswana is a well-known example, but Taiwan, Singapore, countries, and of course the Marshall Plan recipient countries after the Second World War. So there you've got examples where countries received a lot of aid and did very well. What's hard to know is whether they did very well because of the aid, whether the aid made no difference, or whether perhaps they did well despite the aid. So we don't really know whether aid led to that kind of lift-off. What we do know is that aid has also been hugely instrumental in improving people's lives. So we know that we've spent aid feeding people, giving them access to health care, giving them access to education, which might or might not have contributed to economic lift-off, but might have done a huge amount of good for people in the meantime. And there we have much stronger evidence of that ongoing benefit, but we find it very difficult to link it to this economic lift-off that we also aspire to achieve.
But is there not a problem with that in the sense that you in a sense, you're describing paying for the public domain or the welfare state or whatever, and that in itself is not wealth generating?
That's right. And so one of the questions is, do we understand aid to be something that has to produce self-generating economic wealth? In which case we don't know whether we can do that. We have some examples, and there's some evidence that aid can lead to economic growth, and I can tell you about some particular literature about that, but it's hard statistically to make that connection. Or should we settle for a less ambitious goal, which is taking some money from very wealthy people like you and me, who will hardly miss very small amounts of money, and giving it to very, very poor people for whom it'll make a world of difference because they won't have to walk for 2 hours a day to fetch water, or they'll be able to send their daughter to school, or their kid won't die in their arms of some disease that we know how to prevent. And if you measure aid as a way of just transferring a bit of income from people who...
As a form of redistribution.
As a form of redistribution, then I think we can say it's been hugely successful. Not all aid is hugely successful, but I think we can say in aggregate there has been a huge impact on human well-being.
And if we look at aid, in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a growing set of critiques of aid of several different categories. Of those critiques, what would you say were the 3 most substantive?
So I think there are important criticisms of aid, and I think those of us who, on the whole, are supportive of aid should take these seriously. One is this question of what it is that aid can achieve. If you read a criticism like Dambisa Moyo's book Dead Aid, what she says is, I'm not talking about the humanitarian aid, the aid that's the welfare benefits. I'm talking about aid as a transformational catalyst. And then she goes on to say, it's very hard to see how...
Going back to the economic piece, in a way.
Right, so I think there the criticism is that we're claiming too much with aid, that we think that we can achieve economic liftoff when the reality is we don't really know how to bring that about. And that seems to me a legitimate criticism of aid, that we make too strong a claim about the likelihood that aid will bring about this transformation.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a completely false claim. I think we can show a statistical connection between aid and growth, but I think the evidence, I think that criticism is valid in that it's much easier to show that aid is producing these other benefits than it is to show that it's producing that liftoff. The second criticism of aid that I think is really worth taking into account is the worry that by giving aid to a government or to provide particular services in a country, we somehow take the pressure off the domestic accountability of that government to its own citizens. That citizens begin to rely on outsiders to provide goods and services and stop expecting their government.
And you create a dependent mentality.
So you create... Well, that's the worry. That's the criticism, is that it prevents or it stifles the evolution of a social contract between citizen and government. And that unless you're very careful with how you produce aid, how you provide aid, that it undermines the kind of fibres of a society in that way. In various, you could call that aid dependency, but you can also think about it in terms of accountability and social contract. So that's the second big criticism. And there I think the question is, are there ways that we could provide aid that doesn't have that effect? And for example, giving cash to individual citizens, so that if a government wants to collect that cash and use it to provide public services, they have to levy a tax on people. And
but it puts it into the hands of the user.
It puts it into the hands of the user, and it doesn't. So you could think of ways that we could give aid better.
And indeed, with mobile phones, you could now ensure that
you could actually, and there are now mechanisms to literally transfer the money straight to the mobile phone of a poor person. The other thing you can do, and the budget support was actually an effort to do this. Budget support is often criticised as, you're just throwing money at a government and enabling them to do whatever you want. But the argument for budget support was always, well, if you give the money to the government for it to use in its budget, then citizens can have a debate and hold the government to account for how that money is used in a way that they can't if you're just providing projects and services through charities or through direct service provision, that it makes the government more accountable for how that money...
You can focus on that budget.
Right. Well, so I think a lot of people think that hasn't quite worked in the way that had been planned, but it was certainly an effort to provide aid in a way that made the government more accountable to citizens. So there's a whole literature about what we should do to prevent aid from having this negative effect. But I think it's certainly a fair criticism that it can have that negative effect, especially if it's done badly, as it often is. The third criticism of aid is somewhat related to the second, which is that it's a mechanism by which there is insufficient feedback from the people who are supposed to benefit from it. That as a way of funding public services, the idea that I, as a British taxpayer, provide money which, through my government and through a chain of intermediaries, produces a service in education or a health system or a road in a developing country. That this isn't a criticism of aid. It's just a fact that any system where the people who are supposed to be benefiting from a service have no way of indicating whether they're happy or not, and the system has no way to learn, to iterate, to improve, it's never going to function effectively. This is a complex system with no feedback loop. And the problem with the aid system is there's no feedback loop. that the people who know whether aid is arriving or not, know whether it's meeting their needs or not, are both geographically distant, but more importantly politically distant from the decisions that are being made about how that aid is used and how those services are provided. And so inevitably it is never going to be a properly responsive set of services. And so eventually the money, over time those services deteriorated, money is stolen, money is wasted, if the services are not provided efficiently, they don't keep pace with new technologies and so on, because there's no feedback loop that puts pressure on them to keep improving. That is something, again, that we can improve enormously with new technologies, using mobile phones and so on. We are much more able now to look and see whether aid is arriving and how it can be improved. I think we should focus on the idea that for most people actually, migration is the mechanism by which development happens. Whether that's within countries, people moving from the countryside to the cities, they do that because that's what transforms their life.
Yeah, there is wealth in cities.
There's and there's back-breaking poverty in the countryside.
Yes.
Right? I mean, it's that migration is actually the mechanism by which development happens for most people.
Yeah.
And international migration is also part of the mechanism.
But then why is so much development aid focused on rural areas then, if the wealth is in the cities?
Well, because the poverty is in the rural areas, right? Of course you would expect to spend your aid in the place where the poorest people are. If you're trying to target the poorest people are rural people.
But we're back to the transformational versus holding in place. We
are back to that. And there can be, I think the development industry is often guilty of a somewhat bucolic vision of the happy peasant, and we find a way to give them better fertilizer or better machinery, and then they will do an honest day's labour in the fields and they'll sit around the fire at the end of the day and they'll be happy together. When actually, of course, it's nothing like that, and for most people development is an appalling dislocation and wrench. I think the idea that investing in agriculture is the way to bring about development is quite common, but it's not obvious to me that it's true in many countries. Very often the way to bring about development is to invest in factories and formal sector jobs out of the countryside. And as people move out of the countryside, so the people who are left behind have higher incomes and a higher standard of living, because demand for food rises, the number of people left on the land falls, so they are able to mechanise and invest more in the land, and you get a virtuous circle of rising incomes. But I think a lot of development thinking is focused on the idea that somehow we want to keep people on the land, and that probably is a mistake.